Welcome to the series, The Search for Inner Peace by Dr. Gerald Mann. Dr. Mann is the senior pastor at the Riverbend Church in Austin, Texas. Let's join Dr. Mann for more of The Search for Inner Peace.
I've been doing a series of sermons on the things that make for peace. Jesus wept over Jerusalem the day before he died and said, "Oh, if you only knew the things that make for peace." How do we achieve the inner harmony that people talk about all the time? And as I've told you all along, this is not a series of sermons by somebody who has it and I'm giving it to you. These are confessions of the fact that I'm trying to find it as badly as you are. Today I'm going to talk about one of the things that disturbs inner peace probably more than anything else, and that's our problem with forgiving other people. And I want to read to you from Matthew, the 18th chapter, if I can get these things on. Okay. Peter said to Jesus, "If my brother keeps on offending me, how many times should I forgive him? 7 times?" Jesus said, "No, 70 times 7. And then he told this story. Once there was a king who decided to check on all of his servants' debts. And just as he'd begun to do so, one of them was brought in who owed him millions of dollars. The servant did not have enough to pay for his debt, so the king ordered him to be sold as a slave along with his wife and children until he could pay the debt. The servant fell down on his knees and began to plead with the king and said, "Please forgive me and be patient. I will pay you everything." The king felt sorry for him and immediately forgave him all of his debt. That man got up and went out and found a fellow servant who owed him only a few dollars. He grabbed him by the neck and started choking him. "Pay me what you owe," he said. The fellow servant fell down and begged him, "Please be patient, and I will pay you back." But he refused and instead had him thrown into jail until he could pay the debt. When all the other servants saw that, they went to the king and told him everything. He called the servant in and said, "You worthless slave, I forgave you the whole amount that you owed me just because you asked me to. You should have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you." The king was very angry and he sent the servant to jail to be punished until he paid back everything he owed. And Jesus concluded by saying to his disciples, "That is exactly how my Father in heaven will treat you unless you forgive your brothers from your heart." How do we deal with this problem of forgiving those who hurt us? There are people who blessed all of us when we were children, or we wouldn't be here, and that is in one piece, or even in half a piece. And in my case, the person who gave me the gift of delight, I've talked about it many times, was my paternal grandmother. She gave me books to read. When I was 12 years old, she said, "I'm going to give you a novel. You love to hunt. You love the outdoors. You've read everything on Africa. I'm going to give you a book about whaling in old New England. It's called Moby Dick, and it's a great fish story." And I got into it, and I couldn't put it down. Here was Captain Ahab and all of the whalers, and they were looking for this mythical great white whale, Moby Dick, and they were all afraid of him, and only Ahab would go after him. And he harpoons the great whale, and his leg gets caught in the line, and it's severed. And as he goes back to recuperate, he becomes obsessed with killing the whale. He recruits a new crew and a new outfit, and he goes out and he chases Moby Dick. And as you know, the more he chases him, the more he becomes consumed with the fact that he's been maimed by the whale. And in the end, he harpoons Moby Dick, and at the great climax of the drama, he is entangled in the lines of his own harpoon, and he is drowned by the whale, and they all die. When I finished reading, my grandmother said, "What did it teach you about good and evil?" And I was only 12 years old. I thought, well, gee, it was just a good fish story. But as the years have gone by, of course, the lesson in that book, in that classic novel, is the all-consuming power of revenge, the inability of Captain Ahab to let go of being wronged, of being maimed. Everybody in this room and everybody watching on television has or will be maimed by somebody else. And nothing robs us of inner peace like resentment and revenge. If we do not find a way to get rid of that, there is no peace. I think that's why Jesus was so adamant about forgiving others. I have tried the best I can for years. I studied the original languages in which the Bible was written. I've studied it in Aramaic and Greek. I've tried to change what Jesus said about forgiving others. Cannot be done. No loopholes. I read the other day where somebody caught the atheist W.C. Fields reading the Bible. What are you doing? He said, looking for loopholes. Well, there aren't any loopholes. Jesus said plainly, if we do not forgive those who maim us, He will not forgive us who maim Him. Our forgiveness and God's forgiveness cannot be separated. That is a harsh saying. That's why I don't like this sermon. When I preached it last service, it stunk. Everybody had a long face, and so did I, and you probably will too. The only thing I know about harder to talk about forgiving is asking for money. So that's the category. How do we forgive? Jesus said, if you don't forgive, God won't forgive you. How can I help? I'm not somebody who's rich in forgiveness, sharing with you unforgiving beggars. I'm a person who fights with this constantly myself. And I can only tell you what helps me, okay? The first thing that helps me is that I try to remember when I'm injured by somebody else, I try to remember that the very best thing I can do for me is forgive. The best thing I can do for myself is forgive. Let me show you what really happens when we're wronged by somebody. It hurts. We know that. It's painful. But why is it painful? There's something deeper. When somebody hurts us, there's a wall put up between us. We're estranged, as the philosophers say. We're separated. And we're not comfortable that way because we're created for community. So when somebody hurts us, we're separated. And that puts us in a prison. The two most popular responses are revenge and resentment. And we think that's normal. Now, revenge, retaliation, is getting even. I mean, I was raised in an environment of getting even. We still talk about revenge game. We say the Broncos won the Super Bowl as revenge. And when I was a boy growing up watching all the Western movies, the guy got revenge. The good guys got revenge. And we all applauded when the blood ran out of the bad guys. I saw a late-night TV thing the other night, and it was so uninteresting that I started keeping score. It was with one of these kung fu guys, and he has a ponytail, and you know who he is if I mention it, but I'm not here to hurt him. But he was the good guy. The bad guys killed 2 people. He killed 37. He broke a pool cue and stuck it through the neck of one. He broke necks. He burned people. He gleefully pushed them off of cliffs. He ran over them in bulldozers. I mean, and I'm sure the audience was saying, yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, revenge is getting even, but there's a problem with it. You can't. I mean, this is not rocket science, okay? But think about this. If getting even worked, the first time in Yugoslavia that the Serbs retaliated against the Croats, it'd all be over. Because in the 1940s, the Croats collaborated with the Nazis to ethnically cleanse the Serbs. They waited 50 years. The Serbs did it back. Well, it would be over, right? No. We have troops over there keeping them separated. If getting even would work, the Arabs and Israelis would have made peace a long time ago. Won't work. It never works. You can't get even. I remember a great big old bully who took my knife that had been given to me by the Cisco Kid. The Cisco Kid's dagger came to the Houston Fact Stot Show and gave me his dagger. It was like the Holy Grail. And this big old bully took one look at it and threw it in the bio. And I hated him, and I waited until his father died. And when he was weeping and walking up the sidewalk, I'll never forget leaning out the window saying, "Glad your daddy died." And he broke down and started weeping and ran in the house. And I felt no sense of being even. I felt a deep sense of loss. Something happened. I call it my fall from grace. There is no getting even. The other thing we do is resent. I looked up the word resentment. I had never done that. Did you know what the root word of, you know what it means to resent? The root meaning? It means to feel over again. Over and over and over and over. That frees us to go through it every day for the rest of your life. I was hurt. I'm going to remember it. I'm not going to forget it. I'm going to hold on to it. And that's how I'm going to be free. Wow. How dumb is that? That's the two popular ways we respond. So Jesus comes along and he uses another word, forgiveness. And I looked up the root meaning of that word. You know what it means to forgive? It means literally to hurl away. It's the picture. You ever carried something real heavy for a long time and then you straighten up and you drop it and you feel like you weigh 2 pounds? That's what it means. It was used to describe a prisoner being released from prison, where he hurled away his chains. He was freed of the things that had bound him. That's the root meaning of the word forgive. And we still have people going around saying revenge and resentment are the best way to deal with hurt. Jesus said, forgive, hurl away. The best thing you can ever do for yourself is forgive. Reginald Denny, you remember him? He was a truck driver in the midst of the L.A. riots and the aftermath of the Rodney King verdict. And we all watched on living television live how he was dragged out of his truck and beaten senseless, kicked until his head literally caved in. A few days later at the preliminary hearing, he was there with his face swollen and grotesque with his lawyers, and the two perpetrators were sitting there passive, steely-eyed, just no feeling at all. Their mothers were there with them. And Reginald Denny suddenly broke away from his lawyers, and they were trying to stop him. And he went over to the two perpetrators and said, I forgive you. And one of the mothers broke down and cried and shouted back to him, I love you. And afterward, the reporters asked him, why did you do that? He said, it was the only way I could find, listen to this, I could find peace. They said, well, do you think it made any difference in the minds of those people who beat you up? He said, I don't know, and I really don't care. I didn't do it for them. I did it for me. The best thing you can do for yourself is hurl away those chains of resentment. The second thing I try to remember is that the best thing I can do to change my enemies is forgive them. That sounds irrational. But you only have two choices when somebody hurts you. Eliminate them or change them. Lincoln said to one of his assistants, he had a long-time adversary that had been dogging him for years, and they had the guy in an uncompromising situation, and one of his assistants came in and said, we've got him. We could ruin his career, disgrace him, get rid of him once for all. Lincoln said, there are two ways to get rid of your enemies. Eliminate them, turn them into friends. Go see if you can find something that this fellow and I have in common so that we can be on the same side. And Lincoln made a friend for life. Joseph says to his brothers, when it's time for him to seek vengeance, they've sold him into slavery, they've sold him away from the family, years pass and he has them at his mercy, and when they say, forgive me, he begins to cry. And he said, who am I to play God? I'm not God, I'm one of you. Forgiveness never occurs until we get on the same side. In that story that Jesus told, all of the servants were in debt. There wasn't just one or two, they were all in debt. You and I are all in debt. We had better not get what we deserve. On Judgment Day, as I've said 1,000 times in this pulpit, I'm going to be very inconspicuous. I'm going to blend in with the crowd. I'm going to get under the rug, under the AstroTurf. And if God wants to let some of you sinners off, that's entirely okay with me. I don't want to smell any hair or any burning flesh, because it's apt to be mine. The best way to change other people is to forgive them. if you think that's idealistic and wrong, you ought to try it. I've been married 40 years today, and I'll never forget the day I got married. I don't know if I'll tell this next service. My wife will be here, but it was one of the saddest days in my life. I didn't want to get married. I got married just because somebody else would have married her, and I thought she was quite pretty. And I didn't want to get married, but I didn't want anybody else to have her. And I was 20 years old and immature, and I loved me, and me wanted her. I was like the Cookie Monster. I love cookie, you know. Yeah, you know. I had no concept of what it meant to love another person. And come to find out, within 6 months, she understood that when she married me. And it was through her grace, because she was a believer. It was through her grace that I came to know what love was all about. Forgiveness is the best thing I can do to change the people who hurt me. Let me finish. Forgiving is the best thing I can do to show the world that God lives in me. Let me tell you something. Forgiving, the reason we don't like sermons like this is that forgiving is an unnatural act. It's natural. We're animals to an extent, and it's natural for us to act like animals. You get into an animal's territory, he'll react. He'll get you. To forgive is unnatural. And people will hear this sermon all over the country and say, what a wimp way to approach life. It is unnatural to forgive. Simon Wiesenthal, who was the Nazi hunter, 89 of his family, 89 of the members of his family were gassed, murdered, shot, killed by Hitler. And he tells of being a young architect, 22 years old. They assigned him to a military hospital, and he had his yellow Star of David on, marking him as a Jew. And one day, one of the nurses came and got him and said, come with me. And he went into a darkened room, and there was a young German officer there, completely swathed in bandages with only the holes sticking out from his mouth and his eyes, blue bottle flies swarming around him. And he said through those gauze, I burned a house full of Jews. And there was a man with two little children. He covered their faces. And he waited until he ignited, and they leaped out the window. And I was ordered to shoot them, and I did. And I cannot die without receiving the forgiveness of a Jew. Would you forgive me? And Wiesenthal said he turned and looked out the window. It was a beautiful sunny day, and the birds were chirping. And he said, I stood there for a long, long time, and then I turned slowly, and I walked out of the room. And then the second half of his book, The Sunflower, he writes 32 scholars, Christians, theologians from all faiths, asking, should he have forgiven the German? And out of 32, only 6 people said that he should. Had he written me, I would have probably said, I'm not a Jew. They didn't kill 89 members of my family. That's too sacred a thing. I couldn't comment on that at all. But then the haunting question comes, what would Jesus have said? And I can tell you what Jesus would have said. I can tell you what he did say. He would say, by this shall people really know you belong to me, if you forgive. Obedience, morality, acting a certain way. Those are not the chief evidences that Christ lives in me. The only way to show the world that Christ lives in us is to forgive. To do the unnatural thing. And unless you forgive, says Jesus, you'll never be out of the prison of revenge and retaliation and the cycle of violence. You'll never know any peace. Another story. Little Corrie ten Boom, that tall, she and her sister put in a Nazi concentration camp for helping Jews. And one day after the war, when her sister had died, and after the war, she went around preaching forgiveness. And one day after she spoke to a big rally, she ran face to face with the SS officer who had tortured and abused her sister. And he said, "Yeah, Corrie, it is good that you preach forgiveness," and stuck his hand out, and she couldn't shake his hand. She said, "All I could say was, God, forgive me. I cannot forgive." And she said at that moment a great burden was lifted from her soul, and she was able to take his hand. Only the Spirit of God in us can bring us to the unnatural act of forgiving. It's the best witness I know. Every one of you here will be maimed. You'll be insulted and hurt this week, even though you didn't seek it or try it. And you'll have a choice to make. You can imprison yourself, or you can hurl away the chains of resentment and revenge. And I pray God's grace on you.
Thank you for joining us for the series, The Search for Inner Peace. For information on other audio tapes or books by Dr. Gerald Mann, please call 1-800-388-9500 or write to Gerald Mann Ministries, P.O. Box 842-076, Dallas, Texas 75284. You can now select the next tape in this series from Dr. Gerald Mann.